Hello students, today we're actually going to combine a couple different lessons because the book mentions wind and it mentions all the stuff we're going to talk about for wind, and then there's only one thing you really care about that's ever going to show up in the rest of the textbook. So we're just going to touch on a couple of those other things, really make sure to understand the one thing that's going to show up a lot, and then we're also going to talk about biomes just so we can have a nice long video, not long, but long similar length for the other videos. So we're going to go ahead and talk about wind, which the last time we talked about climate and weather, we really talked about the sun and what the sun does, including making wind from those temperature differences. Now here, look at this. She's flying back, not a great time. But what happened? Are these her friends here that grouped together? Don't be friends with people like that. That'll leave you behind. These are friends that'll leave you to get eaten by zombies. Not good friends. Now I know you must be thinking, well, Miss Lemon, does that mean that there's places that don't have wind? If there's places that have wind, are there any places that don't? And there are, and we call them doldrums. You guys do not have to memorize this slide and all of the things like horse latitudes and so on. This just kind of shows you how some of those wind systems kind of work. Cool, but otherwise you don't have to memorize it. Be careful too if you look up this word later. Doldrums has a different meaning in everyday English, which it means something along the lines of a long stretch of boredom. So not the same thing. Because if you get stuck in the doldrums, it's a long stretch of death, imminent death. I mean, can you imagine being stuck here as a sailor? What would you do? I feel like I would get into, I don't know, break a piece of the ship off and just I don't know. What would you do, So it's pretty scary stuff if you got stuck there. So you'd rather ride along or sail along these things called prevailing winds, and really you're probably going to care more about this for a history class, because the things like the trade winds are named because of trade. So that's really how you'd care about that, or if you do any sailing. Otherwise, one thing to remember though is that these can be seasonal. So the trade winds can actually have a different movement. We end up with things like the monsoon wind system, which we're on here in Korea. So sometimes the wind will bring dryness and sometimes it will bring wetness. So it is a little different. Wet summer, not a good time. This is one of the things the book wants to mention. I'm going to mention it again. There is a video you can watch. It'll help you. Other than that, don't care too much about it. So basically in the Pacific Ocean, there's a warmer side and a cooler side. The warmer side is the west. The cooler side is the east. Typical. Okay. However, during an El Nino, the warming kind of moves. So now it's warm sort of in the center and more on the east. And really you only care about that if you live in this area. It's going to affect the rain. It's going to affect some of the temperature. And again, you only really care about it if you happen to live here. And you're a farmer or something, or if you're trying to do any kind of traveling in this region, you would always check the temperature, I think, anyway. So just be aware that if you're going to these regions, so that would be East Asia or West Americas, so in the North and South America. If you are visiting, just check to see if it's an El Nino or La Nina year, because otherwise you can't expect the temperature and climate and precipitation and stuff to be normal. So if you go to an area and you expect it to be dry and hot, it might be not so hot and pretty rainy, depending. So that's really the only way that you guys might ever encounter this and care about it. That's really all I can think of. And if it is dry, I mentioned to my students, if you guys care about your skin, do check. If it's an El Nino year, you might want to invest in more moisturizer. That's really the only way I could make it somewhat relevant to you guys. So again, you guys can watch this video. It'll be in the details section below. But the takeaway here is that it used to have a larger span, so it happened between every 2 and 7 years. Now it's kind of tighter, so it's between every 3 and 5 years. So that is pretty interesting. The Coriolis effect, again, this is something that you guys really won't ever really care about. This affects large fluids, to include air, and you'd only really even see it if you're really high up in the atmosphere. So for something like a hurricane, cyclone, or typhoon, they're all the same, just different names based on where it's located. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it's going to rotate counterclockwise. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it'll rotate clockwise. Why does this happen? Check the video. The video is really helpful for that, but again, why would you care, right? Most of you are watching this just out of curiosity, or somebody made you watch it, or you've got a sort of review for school. You're not planning on becoming a meteorologist or something. If you are, yeah, definitely memorize the Coriolis effect. But otherwise, the stuff you would care about for a hurricane, a cyclone, or a typhoon is how dangerous is it, when's it supposed to hit, and where am I supposed to go? You don't care that if you look at it from above, it's spinning one way or the other, right? You just care, is it showing up at my house? What do I do? The one that you really do care about is the rain shadow effect. And the rain shadow effect is really interesting because we just see it everywhere. I think it's interesting anyway. So if we can check this out, we have this little red pin on here, and that's for pointing out this mountain range. This is going to be the Himalaya mountain range, India to the south and China to the north. And if we see on the India side of this ridge, which is the mountain range, it's green. But on the China side, it's super dry. And we can actually see this in other places, like this is in South America. Again, that ridge in we can kind of see here, and we see on one side it's totally green, and on the other side it's totally brown, right? And this is in Washington State, which is in the northwest of the United States. And again, one side's really green and one side's really brown, and there's this bumpiness sort of in the middle. What is going on? You guys can check out this video. The guy is a little bit dorky, which is great. That's why I included him. But just to really break it down here, very simply, we need an ocean, so some really large body of water, such as an ocean, and then also a mountain range, so not like one mountain, but like a whole range of mountains. So step one is the water gets evaporated. Now we have this wet air above the water. Step two is that wet air gets blown inland, so it's blown over the land, and eventually it starts going up the side of the mountain. And of course, you guys know, the higher up a mountain you go, the colder it gets. So what happens to that hot water vapor as it cools down? You know, it condenses, makes clouds, drops a bunch of rain or snow. So we get the side that's super green because it's just got a bunch of rain. However, that air is still traveling. So that air is still blowing over the mountain. And as it goes down the mountain, it starts to heat up again. And once it gets towards this like bottom sea level area, now we have that hot air, but it's dry. So that hot, dry air now is going to suck up any moisture it can from the land, from the plants, from the animals. And so we end up with that side as a desert. So to start off from part one, we have this wet air. But as it's going up the mountain, it cools, becomes a cloud, drops all of that rain or snow, but the air keeps moving. This dry air warms up as it goes down the other side of the mountain, and now as dry, hot air, it just takes the moisture out of everything. So we have a desert on that side, where we have a green, lush area on the other side. So it is pretty interesting to see. Just such an extreme, isn't it? The lake effect is a little bit similar. Again, you guys are only really going to care about this if it's relevant to you. This is going to be part of the United States. It's near the Great Lakes, and unfortunately this is not animated like it should be. But if we can kind of see around this white little hangy guy here, there's a lot of dark red. Okay, so this is going to be part of the lake effect, and unfortunately that snowfall animation shows it changing a lot more, which is pretty interesting. But basically how it works is that we have some of this wet air comes up again. So it comes up from the water. The wind blows it over the land, and in this case the land is very cold. It's in the middle of winter. So that wet air is just going to condense into a cloud and then drop a bunch of snow. Not usually rain. If you live in an area where it's right around the freezing temperature, you do tend to get some rain, but you end up with tons and tons of snow. Really, the only way I can see this being relevant to you guys is if you want to do some traveling, get like a second home or buy a primary home, and you either really love snow or you really hate snow, then it's pretty relevant to you when you visit, if you want to live near a lake. So if you hate snow, probably only visit your cabin near the lake in the summer. You know what I mean? But if you really love snow, hey, definitely check it out in the middle of the winter. If you guys want to know a little bit more about specific heat, you can. The book mentions it a bit. Basically, we had mentioned it before, where if you go to the beach in the morning or at night and it's kind of cold, the rocks or sand, it's going to be rather cold to your bare feet. And so you think, oh, if I touch the water, it's also going to be cold. But once you touch the water, it's actually kind of warm. But the opposite happens if you go in the middle of the day when the sun is just right above. That sand or rocks is going to be very, very hot. But when you touch your foot into the water, it's going to feel quite cold. And that just has to do with how well rocks and sand will absorb and release heat versus water to absorb and release heat. That's really all that's about. So now we can talk about natural disasters, which are terrible, but they're also really interesting, so kind of fun. If you guys want to watch this video, it just shows you a basic on how tornadoes form, and it'll mention stuff like most or sometimes. The reason for this is tornadoes are pretty hard to study. I mean, a tornado is like a day ender, if not a life ender. So when you see a tornado, your instinct should be to go away. So for somebody to want to go towards the tornado, not super common. And then on top of that, to figure out how to measure the tornado, like what instruments can we use, what are things that we need to check out. So not only do we need people that are brave enough to confront a tornado, we also need luck, because sometimes you can think the tornado is going to be coming pretty close to where you can measure it and it just goes off course, or you think you're safe and then the tornado comes at you and just ends your day. So you need luck, but you also need the correct instruments. So this is why storm chasing as a job is really important, but also we're still not 100% sure why tornadoes form sometimes, and other times it seems like there's all the right ingredients for a tornado and it just doesn't show up. So it does kind of explain how that works. Maybe skip ahead a minute. There's a lot of like preamble that I don't find very interesting, but you guys might. So if we're going to look at like the different strengths of tornado, this is done with the Fujita scale. You may have heard of like an F1 or an EF1. So that is how they work. Now the tornadoes go from 0 to 5, and we can kind of check this out. If you have any sound and you want to check this out later, it does have a pretty haunting sound, which is kind of cool. The reason that we're not going to watch the video and listen to the sound for any of these videos is because YouTube thinks that we're abusing copyright stuff, and we're just not, but that we just want to avoid that copyright flag. So this is our little person as a size comparison, and so we're going to see this F0, okay? For the EF0, this is the lowest grade of tornado. It's just like, hey, it barely became a tornado. We're still going to get some damage, like tree branches will break off. It might damage some roads, it might damage some roofs, it might damage some train tracks. So if we go forward to the EF1, the roofs will get stripped. So not destroyed completely, but they'll be pretty badly damaged. If you have a mobile home, it can be overturned. And for things like windows and doors, those can break and be really, really dangerous. So you don't want to stay next to like a window or a door. A dust devil is going to be a tornado that can be very dry. So that's what they're mentioning here. A water spout, it's not like from an ocean. It is formed like from the cloud condensation. So this is a little interesting. For the EF2, your roof will be just goodbye. If you have a large tree in your yard or nearby, this will start snapping. So you really want to be careful if you're outside. You also want to be careful because cars can be lifted off the ground. Now, they're not going to be launched anywhere just yet, but they can be picked up and dropped. So even if you're inside of a vehicle, you're still not safe, and you should still wear your seatbelt. The steam twister that they're mentioning, these are from geysers, which is kind of cool. So the F3, when we talk about well-constructed houses, we're talking about houses with good foundation, with made out of bricks, made out of concrete. So these will be really damaged, really destroyed. Train cars can be flipped over. Trees can have not only being snapped, but also they can be stripped of their bark. So just like a really high wind speed. And this is when we can start throwing the cars around. What's showing up here on the left is a fire whirl or a fire-nado. So not only can you have a tornado, but this can also pick up fire. We can see a lot of these videos from Australia because everything's going to kill you in Australia, right? So it's not a great time. Just imagine how horrible that would be, just seeing that. Here's the F4. We're damaging skyscrapers. Cars are launched. Houses are launched. And then also you can just delete your house. Just not a good time. There was a house there and it's not there anymore. And then the F5, this is trucks and big houses. Those are being launched. They're thrown. You can just get a house put on top of you. Steel structures are damaged. Skyscrapers will collapse. And for the rest of these, they're talking about different types of tornadoes. The Joplin tornado here, we do have footage of from a school, and you guys can check that out again in the details section below. There'll be a link. It is pretty interesting and pretty recent. So again, more tornadoes that they're going through. But then, if we kind of zoom out, this is the smallest hurricane that we've tracked. So just kind of shows you the relative size. And this is going to be the largest hurricane, so you can't even see the little tornadoes anymore, or definitely the person. But I do like the ending here because this is the red eye for Jupiter, so that's going to be the largest one in our solar system, which I think is kind of interesting that it's included. So again, here's that middle school kind of footage. There's no sound for it, so you can watch it anywhere if you have headphones or not. And I would speed it up to maybe 2 times. So it's, because it is a little bit slow. There's like these, it'll show a different section and then there's just like dead. And then a bunch of action. So maybe 1.5 or 2 times the speed. If there's a tornado showing up, you want to go to an interior room at the lowest level. So this means a basement is preferable, and the interior room they're talking about is that there's not, on the other side of the wall, it's not outside. If that's not possible for whatever reason, stay far away from doors and windows. So those are always really bad. If you're outside, it says lay flat in a ditch. I would add pray to any deity that you can think of. That is not the place you want to be. You know, I mean, what if you're outside and you get something flung into your body, right? You get something flung into your neck or like through you. And what should you guys do if that happens? You know, if you have an accident at home even, and you put a knife accidentally into your leg, or you fall down and you got scissors jabbed into your shoulder, what do? Do you take it out? Do you leave it in? In this case, the movies are right. You do want to leave it in. Otherwise, you can bleed out, which is not ideal. Don't want to die there, okay? For hurricanes, they form over water, and they're a lot larger, as we saw. They also have a kind of a calm middle part. So if you ever are caught in the middle of like a typhoon, hurricane, or cyclone, And suddenly it just seems like it went away. Just stay in your house. Okay. We use the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. We also just call them category or CAT. For CAT 1 is the lowest, CAT 5 is the highest. Just to give you guys an idea, these are some sizes down here, these little swirls or donuts looking things. And then this large donut next to the sign here, the yellow sign, that was the size of Hurricane Katrina. So that was a big problem. It was 620 kilometers wide and very, very, very costly hurricane. So just to briefly go through these, for Cat 1, you're going to get some damage to the home, some damage to trees, but also power cuts. So if you hear that a hurricane is coming and you have to stay in the area, have a backup way to have power, especially if you're the type of person that really needs to use your phone or computer, or if you have any kind of medical equipment that is electrical and needs to be charged. For Cat 2, we're going to get more damage. Cat 3, we're going to get bigger damage, major damage. So we're getting those well-built homes again that are suffering. Not only from the winds themselves, but again, just from all this stuff flying around and smashing into your house. With Cat 4 being even worse, trees start falling over. And then Cat 5, a lot of buildings are destroyed. Roads get just cut off. Do be careful because these tend to be pretty wet. So you may not be safe in the basement. Just be careful that it might start flooding. Not awesome. So typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones, as we can see, they all are around the equator. We just call them something a little different depending on where they're located. And this last one just kind of for fun, that hexagon-shaped storm that we looked at for Saturn. If we were to put it over Earth, that's the size of it. So it is quite big, 10,000 kilometers. And it says category question mark, question mark, question mark. I feel like that's such an RPG thing. You know, like you see this other character and what's their level, you know, so it's kind of fun. Or like when you're playing Pokemon Go and it's like, oh, what's the CP, you know, something like that. All right, so for the biome section, we all know the Lorax and what he does. You know, he speaks for the trees. And what do the trees say? Pretty much just leave them alone, right? Don't burn them down. And yet we can't seem to follow the rules, okay? In this case, this is from a CNN article about a California fire that was started by gender reveal parties. Not great. That being said, you can pause the video and think of or write down all the different ways that a wildfire or a forest fire can start. Let's think about some different ways. Human-made, natural, anything. Take another sip. So one of the interesting things about these is that they are natural. So a lot of the students, they'll talk about like flicking a cigarette or a campfire that wasn't put out. Those are both definitely ways to start a fire. But lightning can also do it as well. And there is an interesting one. Actually, I forgot to load this up, but it is really cool, so I think we should check it out. It's ball lightning. It's really exciting. Can we find it? Here's the video. All right. So ball lightning is really, really interesting stuff, I think. Can we... No, this isn't the video I wanted. Oh, no. We can try to find it again. Otherwise, we'll just leave it alone. I think this was the video that I showed some of the students. It's a similar video anyway. So ball lightning is pretty funky. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a ball and it's lightning. So it's pretty weird. It is a natural phenomenon, but I've never seen it in person in my life. So I don't know about you guys if you've ever seen it. If you have, please share. I'm pretty glad that I haven't seen it because I feel like my instinct would be to go try to touch it, and I'd have to keep telling myself, don't touch the lightning. So I'm glad I haven't seen that. But that's an interesting one. Another one that can start without rain is heat lightning. So heat lightning is usually from cloud to cloud, but it can make some sparks closer to the ground. And so that's how you can get a dry area, but also have a natural fire. Some burning stuff floating over from a volcanic eruption. That's another one my students had mentioned that I never really considered, but yeah, that's definitely a way that we can have a natural fire. What is interesting, I think, about this is that the forest fires, especially, they're normal. They're supposed to happen. We actually have some plants that have evolved to release their seeds after a forest fire. So, like, they have to have this high heat present in order for them to reproduce, which is kind of neat. One of the problems, though, is we like to live in the forested areas and we don't tend to like our stuff burning down. So as soon as we get a forest fire starting, we call somebody to put it out, which makes sense, right? The problem is that there was a bunch of dead stuff that should have burned up and it didn't. So now it kind of piles up. All these dead leaves, dead trees, and all of that just kind of piles up. And then another fire starts, and then we call someone to put it out, and all right, so it piles up again. And eventually it gets to that point where there's so much fuel, all this dead stuff, there's so much fuel for this fire that when another one starts, it just becomes too much of a rager to really put out easily. And that's how we get all these really insane fires that burn for so long and do so much damage. So it's actually our fault for putting them out, which is kind of, how would you fix it? For the biomes, basically, if you live in a different climate, there's different stuff that's there. And the stuff that's like the plants and animals, the living stuff, that's what we call the biome. Now, we'll talk about tropical in a second, but we'll go through these real quick. We're going to start with savanna. So if we check out savanna, the savanna biome, how would you guys describe this? So especially if you're taking notes, how would you kind of describe this? One thing I ask my students to give them an idea of how they can describe it is, if you have to explain this to somebody who's like 11 years old, how would you explain to them what a savanna is based on what you see here? What are some characteristics that you notice in all of these pictures? So a lot of the answers are things like flat, looks kind of dry, there's a lot of grass, and there's some trees, but it's not a forest. And all of those things are true. A lot of the savannas will have something called a wet, dry climate, which just means that there's a wet season where you get lots and lots and lots of rain, and a dry season where you get almost no rain. So you need plants that can survive this. So the types of trees that can grow here are trees that do well with those two extremes. Sort of similar is going to be the grassland, which is just a grassy land. Okay. That's a grassland. And again, we'll talk a bit more about that. We also know what a desert looks like, right? So a desert has how it kind of looks, okay? What makes it a desert, though? It's dry, not hot. So please remember that. Low precipitation. Remember, the largest desert on the planet is going to be Antarctica. So similar, cold, dry. Also on that list is going to be the tundra, which I misspelled as tunda. It's not the tunda, it's the tundra. Okay. We can see what? Again, pretend that you're trying to describe this to a younger person. What are some common things that you see? Some common features. I mean, there's snow, but sometimes there's not. So it is pretty dry overall, and I do not see one tree. Do you? There's a reason for that. And the reason that it says here, it's going to be the bottom right, purple, Arctic and alpine tundra. Alpine is like the Alps, so we're talking about high altitude, okay? We're also going to get, I'm going to look up tree line, no, timberline geography, because there's like some stuff named timberline. This is the kind of thing that you can expect to see for a timberline or this high altitude look. we see lots of trees, and then there's suddenly no trees, right? It's like a line. That's what we call it, a timber line. So there's trees, there's no trees, okay? We see it again here, no trees, and there's that alpine zone. So the alpine zone, the Arctic zones, those tundras, what do we really need to grow trees, right? We need sunshine, we need carbon dioxide, we need nutrition from the soil, and we need rain. These areas being pretty dry makes it pretty difficult to get that rain. But the other big issue is nutrition. Nutritious soil comes from dead stuff. Dead stuff breaks down, gets in the soil. So we're not having a ton of dead stuff in this area, so we don't have a ton of that nutrition put back into the soil. The other problem is that I need my roots to reach that nutrition and suck that nutrition out of the dirt. But in places that are really high altitude or high latitude, so close to the poles, we have this stuff called permafrost. So you know that if we dig down, there's water. In places where it's really cold, if you dig down, there's a spot where it's just frozen. That can be pretty high as well, so it can be pretty close to the surface of the dirt, even when it's not in the winter. So it's pretty difficult for me to stick my roots deep into the dirt if I can't break through that ice, that permafrost. So those are some of the reasons that trees do not grow in this area. We also have chaparral, that's sort of that burgundy color. Now this one is going to be a little difficult sometimes for the students to try to describe. So again, imagine you're describing this to a younger person. We can see a human here, sort of in the lower left quarter. It's kind of mountainous. It looks pretty dry. Not as dry as a desert. I don't really see any forest though. It's kind of a bushy forest. There's bushes. It's kind of crunchy. That's sort of it, right? So I kind of think about it as like a crunchy, hilly grassland. That's just the way that I sort of think about this. And we'll talk a little bit more about it too. For the boreal forest, these are going to be next to the tundra regions. Boreal just means in the north, like aurora borealis. Aurora is light, borealis is in the north, aurora australis is in the south. So these are northern forests. And just like you can expect, they're going to be very cold, so they're going to be these pine trees or evergreen trees. And as you might guess, they're not going to have a great growing season. So they still have to deal with it being pretty cold, pretty difficult to grow. So they tend to grow more slowly than similar trees in other areas around the world. It's also called the taiga. The boreal forest kind of extends around some different regions around the world. So we end up with some different names sometimes for the same thing. The last one was a deciduous forest. Deciduous leaves are these big, fat, flat leaves. The opposite is called a coniferous leaf, and we'll look at that too. A coniferous leaf or coniferous tree is going to be a really thin kind of needle or a pine needle kind of tree. I'm trying to see if I can get to my charger real quick. It looks like I misjudged, but that's okay. We'll go through this anyway. Think about eating leaves. For some reason, when I ask people about this, my students that were raised in Korea, none of them have done this. But the students that were raised in different countries, they've all done this. So if you've ever tasted like a pine needle, they're very strong flavored. They don't taste very good. Whereas something like a maple leaf, it's not going to taste like maple syrup, but at least it's going to have a mild, nice flavor. So that's going to be a way to remember it. Deciduous is delicious. Coniferous is a Christmas tree. That's how I remember it. So deciduous is delicious. We kind of eat those big flat ones, right? Lettuce, cabbage. We like the big flatties. Okay? Good time. So the words that you guys are going to see a lot of, number one is a tropical zone. Okay? This is the Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn, and everything in between is going to be the tropical zone. And I am going to pause this for just a second because I don't want this to die. So just please give me 2 seconds here. You guys can think about the tropics. You can think about the last time you went there, if you've ever been there. All right, perfect. So for the tropical zone, it's the equator area, which you can think, okay, it's going to be hot, it's going to be humid, but that's not what you need to remember. Tropical zone, tropics, that's it. So it falls between these 2 latitudes, these tropics, that's it. That's what makes it tropical. There are places in the tropics that are high mountains, and those places are going to be cold. There are places that are on the other side of a rain shadow, so they're going to be dry. So just because it's in the tropics doesn't mean it must be hot and it must be humid. It usually is. It just means it falls between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Next to the tropical is the subtropical. We also call this temperate just because it's not very extreme. It doesn't have extreme cold and extreme heat, so we tend to call that the temperate zone. A lot of you probably live in the temperate zone. That's where a lot of you probably live. Finally, we have the polar area, so just the tippy tops and bottoms that we've got here, the South Pole and the North Pole. So I guess quick question, where do penguins live? North Pole, South Pole, both poles. So they are in the South Pole. What about polar bears? North Pole, South Pole, both poles. They are in the North Pole. So that means a polar bear isn't going to eat a penguin anytime soon. Penguins don't have to worry about that, which is nice. But they still have predators. They've got seals, which will eat them, and then killer whales. Killer whales are scary. They are so scary. If they know, like, let's say they're chasing a seal or they're chasing a penguin, and their prey jumps out of the water. These insane hunters will like stick their head out of the water and look. And if they can see that they're not like fully on land, they're like on a little iceberg, like a flat iceberg, they will still try to get them. So they can try to knock them over by tipping up one corner and having those guys slide down. The other option is for them to get together as a group, swim towards it and turn, so that way it sends a wave towards their prey and splashes or knocks them off into the water. That's the scariest thing to me. These are water animals, and they've figured out non-water physics good enough to still hunt outside of the water. I mean, that's insane. How scary is that? Steer clear of killer whales. So for types of trees, again, we talked about the broadleaf deciduous, needle leaf coniferous, and then these scale trees. So these are the basic shapes. The easiest way to kind of break them down is what I have here, where we have low sun, high wind, low nutrition, and that's really good for conifers. Okay. For deciduous, these trees are going to need lots of sunshine. They don't do well with wind, and they need lots of nutrition, which makes sense. If you think about how to build muscle, right? We're trying to build new cells. We got to do all that exercise, but we also need enough nutrition to rebuild those cells. And you can kind of think of it that way. To build out a nice big leaf, to build all those cells, we need that nutrition. And of course, it's nice, big, and flat surface to absorb that wonderful sunshine. So there must be lots and lots of sunshine to absorb. Otherwise, why would you build such a big leaf if you live in an area that doesn't have enough sun? Kind of sucks, wastes your nutrition. And also, these big leaves have a hard time with the wind, because they can catch the wind very easily. So if it is windy, it'll rip off those leaves, and now the tree has to regrow leaves, and that takes a while. It takes nutrition, it takes sunshine, so not awesome. This means that a deciduous tree would probably grow where? Tropical, subtropical, or polar? Where would it probably grow? Now, if you said tropical, great. And if you said tropical, but maybe subtropical too, awesome, okay? The conifers, again, that boreal forest, right, towards the north, okay, so towards the polar region, that's where these tend to grow. So would that mean that if there's a lot of deciduous stuff here and a lot of coniferous stuff here, that somewhere in the middle it's going to be mixed? Yes, and that's exactly what we call the forest, is a mixed forest. I can go outside right now and pick up a handful of coniferous leaves and a handful of deciduous leaves. They're just out there. And just based on demographics, most likely you can too. For the scale, it's sort of in the middle, somewhat good sunshine. It can withstand high winds pretty well, and then it doesn't need a ton of nutrition. So similar, what would you say, more similar to the coniferous, I would say, right? Because they are a type of conifer. So again, that's the mixed forest, or we can also call them temperate forests because it happens in the temperate or subtropical zone. That being said, what about the general biomes? Okay, so again, a desert is dry. And you guys know forests are lots of trees together, so what else do we have? We have a grassland, which we looked at before. Again, it's flat and it's grassy. They're pretty dry. They're not as dry as a desert, but they're pretty dry. A lot of stuff doesn't really grow here. They can be cold, they can be warm, they can be high altitude, they can be low lying. Now, we sometimes call them a steppe or a prairie. There's a lot of names for them because, as you can see, they're found in a lot of different places. So each region will have their own word for it. One thing I find really interesting about them, again, we're just going to kind of pass through this and not really watch it. So here we have a prairie. This is a grassland in the United States. And we got this fox, hungry, looking around. And here we have these things called prairie dogs. So they're kind of floofy, kind of small, and they live underground. And they're checking out for these foxes, okay? Fox is trying to come get them, trying to find him. This guy is rethinking where he lives. How come we don't live in trees? Oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. Because the problem is that once this guy finds you in your little house, it's pretty easy to eat you, okay? So he's going, trying to find him, and eventually he does succeed. Over here, you can kind of see the prairie dog watching as this guy's pulling out his bloody face, okay? So why am I showing you this? Well, here in Tibet, we have another type of grassland with one of my favorite animals, the Tibetan fox. It's very strange looking. It's got a really big head relative to its body. It's got a square skull. It's got like a little smile. Very interesting animal looking, okay? Very rocky as well, but again, it does kind of qualify as a grassland because there is grass. This is just not a good season for it right now. Unlike the prairie, we've got this big old bear, and the fox kind of likes to hang out with the bear because of that permafrost. The bear is able to kind of break through some of that hard, cold ground to get our good friend. These are the pika. They look kind of like a chinchilla rabbit. Very sweet looking, probably very delicious. Okay, these are going to be the main part of the diet for both this guy who looks like he's had enough of your day, right? And the bear as well. So these guys kind of work together. The bear will try to attack one spot. The pika can try to run out a different exit. And if the fox knows the other exit or the other side of the burrow, it can go wait. And you can see he's licking his chops. He's ready. The pika, not so ready for this. So the bear is doing his thing on one side. The fox is going over here. The pika's screaming with its little vampire teeth. And the fox eventually is victorious. Okay. I think it's really cool. These are in two totally different areas. This is going to be in China. And the other video we watched was in the United States, but they're grasslands. We've got animals that are adapted very similarly. I just think it's really interesting how that happened. All right. We talked about the savanna. Again, we can look at it. We see it's in that tropics. So right around the equator, if you look up or down, there's those dot, dot, dot kind of dotted lines. That's going to indicate the tropics. Okay, the latitudes for the tropics. So we can see that the savannas tend to be in this region. So again, it's like a grassland but with some trees. And we got these baobab trees, which are super fun. And if you've ever seen them drawn, like in, I guess, Madagascar or something, in the movie Madagascar, this is really how they look. So it wasn't a style choice to draw them this way. They really do look like this. It's pretty cool. So again, you want a tree that can handle this, and trees that can handle this are being used, but this by this I mean lots of rain and then dry season. Trees that can deal well with this are being used in the Great Green Wall, which we'll talk about when we start talking about Africa. And it's a way to kind of reclaim some land that had been lost. It's a pretty cool tool, which is really interesting. Now the chaparral, if we look at the middle of this map, we can see where most of the purple is. It's in southern Europe and northern Africa. The white between those two, so between Europe and Africa, is the Mediterranean Sea. And this is why we can see here at the bottom too, that purple says areas with Mediterranean climate. That's why we call it that. Most places that have a chaparral are in the Mediterranean. We can see again, it is that crunchy thing. It's pretty dry, it's got rocks and hills, and it's just that bushy forest, I would say. And I got this little cat kind of crunch on this crunchy bush. That's really how you can see it. Like if you're a giant stepping through here, it's just gonna go crunch, 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 crunch as you walk through. That's gonna be your rocky chaparral. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, please post them, of course, in the comments section below. And again, all of the videos, the ones that we watched and the ones that we didn't watch, will be posted in the details section below. But I hope you guys learned something. And again, questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will see you in the next class. Bye-bye.